Well, good afternoon, all, and welcome to this week's edition of our ShawLocal.com Bears Insider podcast. I am Hub Arkush, and I am joined by our Shaw Media Group sports editor, Kyle Nabors, and our ShawLocal.com Bears Insider beat reporter, Sean Hammond. And guys, not lacking for news in the last week or so as stories keep breaking around the Chicago Bears. And I guess the place we will start is what we're heading into the final preseason game with Saturday night. It's not really news. It's something that Matt Nagy and Ryan Pace have been telling us from the moment they drafted Justin Fields. But early this week, in announcing that Justin Fields will start the last preseason game in Nashville, Matt Nagy also reconfirmed absolutely that the reason is because Andy Dalton is the Bears starting quarterback versus the Rams in the season opener, and that, like most starting quarterbacks, he's just going to be rested and protected in the final preseason game. So, Sean, I think we start with that part. We've been trying to tell people all spring and summer long, this is where the Bears were going. This is the way it is traditionally done around the NFL. For whatever reason, there is a huge segment of Bears Nation that just doesn't want to believe it or doesn't want to support it. But I think we can at least say, let's stop wasting time talking about it, at least week to week. We'll see how it goes week one against the Rams. But it will be Andy Dalton under center when the regular season kicks off.
Yeah, really no surprise there. And for those of us who have been out at practice too, that's been obvious in the fact that Justin Fields hasn't really taken very many, if at all, reps with the first team offense. And that was still the case today on Thursday heading into Saturday's preseason game, even though Andy Dalton's not playing this weekend. But yeah, so we know that Andy Dalton is going to be the starter on September 12th in Los Angeles. And Matt Nagy did say that, maybe, I don't know if it was the first time he said it. It may have been. It was pretty much implied that, results are going to matter for Andy too. So at a certain point, if he's not getting the job done, it sounds like, they're not going to be afraid to move the Fields at some point this year.
Carl, it's funny. I don't understand why he has to say it. And I'm not taking a shot at Sean here. This is what the feedback we keep getting. It's if all of this stuff is it kind of, leaks out as news. It's the way you run an NFL football team. Andy Dalton is the starter. And if Andy Dalton doesn't produce points and win games, they're going to look to somebody else, much like they did 4 years ago when Mike Glennon was the starter until halfway through week 4, much like they did with Mitch Trubisky when he was the starter last year, and much like they did with Nick Foles when he was the starter and Mitch got the job back last year. This is all a given. And yet, for some reason, with this Justin Fields phenomenon, every time we talk about this, there's some new news breaking when all it really is the Bears being pretty consistent with what they've said all along. And more importantly, with what is the traditional norm and has been the most successful in the National Football League.
Yeah, I mean, agree or disagree, the Bears have been consistent about their messaging that Andy Dalton is going to be the week 1 starter pretty much throughout the summer. And, in all actuality, Justin Fields hasn't done enough in the preseason and throughout camp to justify throwing him out there. Now, as I've stated in the past, my thing is that Andy Dalton, I believe, is a bad enough starting quarterback that it's really not much of a downgrade, even if Justin Fields struggles early. But, I mean, that's not the way they're looking at it. They think Andy Dalton can be the game manager that helps them win games. But it's funny you say, Hub, that, now that they've made it official that we can put this to bed, but we got another preseason game where Justin Fields is going to see the entire first half, it looks like. If he goes out and plays well, it's not going to change the Bears' mind, but it's certainly going to allow it to continue to kind of linger in the mind of Bears fans throughout the next couple of weeks.
Well, and Bears fans can feel however they want. Nobody's telling them how they should feel, but I hope, if nothing else, they're learning it's not going to change anything. And Sean, I think more to the point, and I understand why you and other media want to point out that Fields hasn't gotten much reps with the ones. But what's more important is that playing with the twos, which really is a mixture, they have not had a true starting offense or defense out there for 10 seconds throughout training camp, in part because of due to injuries, veteran load management, whatever it may be. But for all practical purposes, with Justin Fields playing predominantly with the twos against the number 2 defense, he should be more effective than he would be playing with the ones. And the real issue here is he has done nothing this preseason to take the job away from Andy Dalton. Yeah, he's been impressive with his legs in 2 exhibition games, and we know he's going to look better running with the football than Dalton or Nick Foles. But when it comes to his arm and arm talent and field generalship and reading the field, he has not had a better camp than Andy Dalton. And as a matter of fact, you can make the argument, because he is playing against the ones and it is a little bit harder, that Dalton's had a better camp than he has. And that's why Andy Dalton is going to be the starter on day one. It's not a question of, as Kyle said, how much of it is a drop-off to Justin Fields. It's probably not a drop-off at all in terms of, well, it's not. Justin Fields is a better athlete and has better arm talent than Andy Dalton. But what we know about the National Football League is Justin Fields is also far more likely, as a rookie who's never been on the field, to make the 1 or 2 or 3 mistakes in a game that can cost you a football game that Andy Dalton, at least at this stage of their careers, is less likely to make. And that's what the Bears are basing this decision on.
Yeah, and Justin said something to that effect. I believe it was after the second preseason game against the Bills. He walked back on his comment a week earlier where he said somebody asked him, about the speed of the game from his first preseason game. He said, "Oh, it wasn't a problem at all." And he kind of walked back on that and said a week later, he said, "Well, I'm going against second and third string guys. I should be in a place where I can walk out there and perform well." And I thought that was really a good thing to see from a young quarterback, that he understands these situations too a little bit. And yeah, he wants to be playing well, and he should be playing well against some of these guys who might not even be playing come week 1 in the regular season.
Well, and Kyle, as our editor, I know you'll remember, people can go to shawlocal.com if they hadn't seen it. In the very first thing that Sean or I wrote after that press conference where Justin said, it's kind of slow, I wrote exactly that. Yeah, that's because you haven't played NFL football yet. He's been playing against guys who may not be as good as some of the teams that Ohio State saw last year, because at least, these were, major college powers that had all their starters on the field. Most of the guys that Justin Fields has been playing against either will not be in the league after next Tuesday, or if they are, they'll be backups who are riding the bench. So again, none of this is negative or to the discredit of Justin Fields or Andy Dalton or Matt Nagy or anybody else. This is just kind of taking a step back and taking all the emotion out of it and understanding that this is the way player development occurs in the National Football League.
I thought it was interesting that Matt Nagy earlier in the week, I believe it was earlier this week, had said that that Justin Fields had progressed to the point where the pre-snap reads, everything in what you want a quarterback to do at the pre-snap level, he was caught up on, was comfortable with, and the next step was him to start recognizing the post-snap analysis or the post-snap read, right? Which you can't really do during preseason. I mean, you can, but it's not going to be nearly as complicated during the regular season, because teams just are not their defenses are not disguising their coverages to the extent that they're going to be during the regular season. So, you're going to see those first couple weeks where you're going to see Justin Fields on the sideline with Andy Dalton with the tablets, looking through those adjustments that need to be made post-snap. And then a couple weeks in, that's when you start to have the discussion a little bit more. If Andy Dalton is struggling, Justin Fields should start to feel more comfortable with those post-snap reads, and then that conversation becomes a much more substantial conversation.
Well, yeah, and again, in fairness to Fields, he can't get comfortable with it until he sees it. Nobody's been game planning in the preseason. It hasn't been first defenses who may not know how to disguise their coverages or aren't going to do it as well. So you just have to be realistic about what the preseason is all about. And what it comes back to, Sean, is the reason that Trevor Lawrence has been named the starting quarterback of the Jacksonville Jaguars, the reason that, for example, Zach Wilson will be named the starting quarterback of the New York Jets, is nobody expects them to win games anyway. They can use this as an extended preseason and develop players. They're at least a year or two away from talking about contending. But then take a look at the situation in Denver, where you've got Drew Lock, who's even going into his second year and has starts under his belt last year. They're starting Teddy Bridgewater for now because they believe they have a chance to contend for a playoff spot, and Teddy Bridgewater gives them a safer path to that. Not necessarily a more explosive offense, not necessarily the ability to put more points up than Drew Lock, but again, that's the guide that teams use to make these decisions. That's why, people are acting like there's some controversy in San Francisco. There's none whatsoever. Jimmy Garoppolo is going to be the starting quarterback if he's healthy. Trey Lance is way behind Justin Fields. So all of this is just consistent with what really fans should have known all along.
Yeah, it really is. And with you look at where the Bears defense is at, they're certainly in that same category where they think that this defense is good enough to win now. It was good enough to get them to the playoffs last year, and maybe some better quarterback play can elevate that a little bit. The schedule is pretty darn tough coming out, or it looks that way anyway right now. We'll know once we get some real game action going. But the Bears are certainly of that mindset that they're trying to win right now, and they think Andy Dalton's going to be the way to do that, at least as things stand currently.
Man, the Hub, you bringing up Drew Lock not getting the start really hurts, because I love that kid coming out of college, but he makes some really dumb decisions on the football field so far at the NFL level.
Well, he does, Kyle, and this gets back to the question, is it because he's dumb? Is it because he's never going to be a field general? Or is it because he just hasn't seen enough yet? One of the things that was in Drew Lock's scouting report coming out of Missouri was that he is aggressive. He does take chances. He does throw into coverage. And in the NFL, you can't do that. So they're trying to coach it out of him because he also has some exceptional arm talent and athletic ability, and I like him a lot too. I do think he's going to be eventually a starting quarterback in the league, and maybe a winning quarterback, and even a playoff quarterback. But right now, there's still a lot to learn. And so, I personally would love to see us kind of move on, at least for the moment, temporarily, from the quarterback situation. As one of you, I think it was Kyle, made the point that, if Fields goes out in Nashville and goes nuts Saturday night, people are going to yell and scream, but it's not going to change anything. There's no chance that it's going to. And I tend to always come back to, how long would Bear fans really be happy if Justin Fields was the opening day starting quarterback and suddenly they woke up and the team was 1-5 and it was another lost season? As opposed to the possibility that maybe the offense is still struggling in the passing game and not scoring enough points, but because of great defense and a solid running game, they can get out to a 3-3 or a 4-2 or 5-1 start and have a season in front of them that the fans that could be promising. I'd like to believe that 9 out of 10 fans would like to see the team win first, regardless of who the quarterback is.
Yeah, totally. Nobody's sitting here saying they can't wait for next year. While Bears fans are surely excited to see Justin Fields with a year under his belt. I mean, you want to win now. That's how this thing goes.
I have a hard time believing this team gets out to a 5-1 start.
I have a hard
Andy
time
Dalton.
believing that too.
But if they can get to 3-3 like that, maybe you're playing well enough on defense and special teams, and you've given Justin Fields enough time to learn those post snap that's when you make the change. I think that's probably the best case scenario for Bears fan, is you're kind of in the middle of the pack and you feel, okay, now it's time to get that boost from the offense and really get things going.
We didn't see last year's start coming either, though.
So that's true.
Who knows?
Well, and guys, let me be as clear as I possibly can. I'm not predicting anything here. Right. I'm certainly not predicting a 5-1 start. I don't see that either. The point was, though, that this is a team that I think does have a chance to be competitive because of all the talent on defense. Because actually, with the offensive line as it now stands, they had their 5 starters on the offensive line out there for the first time in practice yesterday. We're recording on Thursday, so this is Wednesday. And even then, they don't stay long because Jason Peters still isn't in game shape. They're still going slow with Jermaine Ifedi. But the reality is, when you look at these 5 starters, if Jason Peters is 90 or 95% of what he once was, and if Jermaine Ifedi can just stop the false starts that he led the league in while playing tackle for Seattle, offensive line might not be that bad. And then it starts to open up whole new equations no matter who your quarterback is. And so to me, that's the next step and the next question. Matt Nagy was asked Thursday morning, what do you hope to see out of Jason Peters Thursday night? Apparently he's going to get a few reps. He's not going to go out there and try and play a quarter or 60 minutes or anything like that. And they then do have 2 weeks for the first time, I think ever, after the last exhibition game to get ready. And Nagy talked about the importance of him working on conditioning and getting in game shape. So to me, a much more important question than who the quarterback is where is Jason Peters going to be come opening night against the Rams, Kyle? Because if you have now plugged that huge hole at left tackle, we know they have a chance to be fairly good from guard to guard. And Jermaine Ifedi was acceptable the last 5-6 weeks of the season last year at tackle. Suddenly we're looking at all different possibilities for where this offense and then where this team could go.
Agreed. I mean, a lot of their prospects, I think, hinge at the tackle positions. If Jermaine Ifedi is average to slightly above average as he was at the end of last season at right tackle, that's good enough. If Jason Peters is still able to play, you're in good shape. I don't have any idea if either of those things are going to hold up, and if not, they are going to be in trouble because, I mean, you've looked. We all like Larry Borum, but I'm not sure he's ready to slide in to be in a starting role. Elijah Wilkinson has not performed well this preseason. We don't know how long. We still don't have a timeline for Tevin Jenkins. I mean, it's only been about a week since he had the back surgery. It'll probably be another couple of weeks before they really know how he's progressing. So a lot hinges for this offense on those tackle positions.
Yeah, I would be concerned just with the depth. As you, to piggyback kind of off what you were saying, Kyle, I mean, chances are somebody's going to get hurt on that offensive line. It's a long season. It happens every year. I would be a little bit concerned about the depth when you're talking about guys who, especially on the left side, I mean, you don't really have anybody behind Peters who's done that before at the NFL level. I think they have the makings of a solid offensive line if everybody's healthy. I don't think it's going to be the best line in the NFL, but certainly those 5 that we're talking about can get the job done well enough to keep your offense moving. Hey
guys, I'm gonna derail us here just for a second because I just saw something pop across Twitter and I want to ask about it. Are we 100% certain this game is going to take place on Saturday night? I don't know if you guys have seen what's happening down in Tennessee today. I know you guys have been out at Hallis.
I just ran home from Ellis Hall so we could start visiting with our audience here. And so, no, to be honest with you, I'm not totally up on what's going on.
By all means, fill us in, Kyle.
The Tennessee Titans have 9 players who have tested positive, including Ryan Tannehill.
And this is just breaking news now?
This is the last couple hours I've seen it trickling in, and it's gone up from a couple players, and now I'm seeing at least 9.
I think I saw the Tannehill thing a couple hours ago and didn't think much of it. I did not realize there were that many players.
Yeah, I would think that Ryan Tannehill wouldn't play in this game anyway. But if they have 9 positive players on that roster, I mean, it took less than that for the NFL to postpone regular season games last year. I don't know that they're going to be anxious to A, travel into that environment, and then B, go out on the field and play. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. I know it's funny because I just filed my column for tomorrow, which is about the importance of this game to a number of the players, not necessarily to the quality of the team. And it would be a shame if they lost it for all these kids on the bubble who have one last chance to go out and try and win a job. But I think safety and health come first. And, Kyle, it's a great call. I would guess that it's probably no better than 50-50 right now with 9 positive tests that this game will stay on schedule.
Yeah, I would say that they could just push it back with 2 weeks, but they have to cut down to 53 by Tuesday, I believe, right?
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, they could maybe push it to Sunday or Monday at the latest. I'm sure these guys or these coaches want to get a look at these bubble guys one more time. But yeah, nine positives is certainly concerning. You have to wonder how quick of a trigger the NFL will pull on it because, do they really want to risk the health of players when it's, at the end of the day, it's meaningless to the NFL.
Yeah.
Well, and you know what else is concerning here, guys? Neither one of you, please correct me because I'm working from memory here. But the Titans were one of the NFL teams that had the most trouble last year. Remember, early in the season, they had outbreaks. They had games getting canceled and rescheduled. And they were, as I recall, disciplined by the league for failing to follow certain protocols 100%. I forget what the details of that were. And so, we've heard about the occasional player here or there going to the COVID list since training camp opened, but I haven't heard anything like this so far about an outbreak with 9 positive tests at the same time. So I think this is probably doubly concerning to the league and could lead to the possibility, even a heightened possibility, that they will cancel this exhibition game. Now, again, we're just speculating here because this news is breaking as we record. But, Kyle, I think it's a great call. I think it's a real possibility in light of what we're hearing now that between 4:30 on Thursday afternoon and 6 o'clock on Saturday night, that this game gets derailed.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting 48 hours to see how this plays out, I'd say.
Well, and Sean, it's also interesting because it's consistent with some of the things we talked to Matt Nagy about this morning, with this being the first time that the Bears are traveling this season. We talked about how they'll handle these protocols, and we have to remember we don't know the number or the percentage, but there are a number of Bears who are unvaccinated. I assume that there are Titans unvaccinated, especially if they've got 9 positive tests in one day. We know how this is working around the country as to who the folks are who are testing positive. And that's even a greater concern, I would think, with taking your players on the road somewhere where you know that there have been positive tests.
Yeah, Matt Nagy was talking a little bit today about how they're doing things on the plane, and they got to have certain areas for the unvaccinated players versus the vaccinated players, and there's different protocols too in the hotel rooms and everything. Once you get to your location, once they get to Nashville, there's different protocols with how vaccinated versus unvaccinated players are to handle everything, and whether that's going out, even leaving the hotel or not. This is all new, especially for the Bears who have had both preseason games at home so far. So it's going to be something to follow here as we move towards the regular season.
Between this and then, I don't know if you guys probably didn't see this either. Isaiah McKenzie, who is a wide receiver for the Buffalo Bills, posted a letter that he received from the NFL league office, who essentially the letter was busting him for not wearing his mask in the building. Clearly he's unvaccinated and he was around teammates. I mean, the letter tells him the time of the day that he was in the building without his mask on around teammates. And he posted it and was joking about it on Twitter, saying haha, you caught me. And it's just guys, between now you have stuff like that, you have the Tennessee outbreak. You would think between now and the start of the season, with the way COVID is going throughout the country right now, that you're going to see the NFL really start to crack down and make sure that these guys understand this is not a joke. They do not want to move games. This is a loss of revenue when they have to do this stuff. They, not funny to them.
Well, and Kyle, even more than that, just looking at the state of the pandemic in general and where we're at in this country and around the world. And again, we're not going to get into anybody's politics here or choose sides, but you would think just that people in general would react in certain ways and take things more seriously, that there's a lot of folks out there who aren't, and so I don't know what to make of that. I actually had seen that on McKenzie, and obviously his teammate Cole Beasley made a complete fool out of himself over the last couple of weeks and now is in quarantine. We're told because of a close exposure, not necessarily a positive test. And so, football players are no different from anybody else, we find, and they're going to do things that they're entitled to do, apparently, according to whatever interpretation of our laws of the Constitution we're working with right now. And so we all have to find a way to coexist with each other's choices. But getting back to our point, not exposing the Bears, both vaccinated and unvaccinated, to what you clearly have to now call an outbreak in Tennessee is a decision that the league can make and can enforce. And that's the one, Sean, that we'll keep our eyes on the next 36, 48 hours.
Yeah, hopefully they get a game in, like you said, especially for those guys at the end of the roster trying to make the team and get a spot. I mean, this is a big game for a lot of those guys.
How does it work during the preseason, Hub? Do these guys get game checks for preseason games?
No, they don't get paid any of their salary in the preseason. They get a per diem. And then I think it's prior to this year. I can't remember if it changed last year or this year, but with the new CBA, they used to get their entire salary in 17 weekly game checks. And I believe that was changed this year to 36 weekly checks to cover what is basically the league's version of the entire off season. But it starts once they make the roster. So no, there's no salary at risk here for any of these players with these exhibition games.
I just was wondering, because that would suck as like an undrafted, guy that got a prorated or whatever for a game, and then you lose that game or something like that. Just was wondering.
Yeah, well, and it actually leads to another just quick mention before we get into the conversation we had originally planned on having, which is, talking about the importance of this fourth game and knowing what it means to the bubble guys, maybe trying to identify for our listeners who we believe those bubble guys are and which way it may go with the Chicago Bears, who are the principal subjects of our podcast. But something else that I was just kind of looking into to try and understand the ramifications of it, lots of changes because of COVID protocols to roster makeup, to practice squads, and specifically with the practice squads, they are expanded again this year. They had been 10 players according to both the old and new CBA. But then last year, when the league had to put these COVID protocols and mitigation practices in place, they negotiated a separate deal with the Players Association. Well, they've negotiated a new separate deal this year, but it will still maintain last year's first ever 16-man practice squads that can include up to 6 vested veterans, 2 of whom can be protected each week. But even those vested veterans and all of the non-vested players on the practice squad will be making roughly, for the non-vested players, 20 to 25%, and for the vested veterans, 30 to 35% of what the league minimum would be for them if they were on the active roster. And so it is still very, very expensive for these guys to get cut. It is even worse, obviously, if they don't get put on a practice squad, unless they have some other career they're going to pursue. But there is a significant financial loss to these kids that get cut, even if they do end up back on the practice squad.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. The Bears have a lot of decisions to make too, as we're about to get into here. It's sometimes I think we're so focused on the football, we kind of forget the financial aspect for some of these kids. It might be their one chance.
Well, we talk a lot of times about, even with some of the day 2 and mid-round draft choices, that first contract, if you're frugal and plan wisely, it can set you up for a long, long time, if not for life. And certainly if you're a day 1 or day 2 draft choice, it should, just with the guaranteed money that you get. Again, if you're wise with it and you protect it appropriately. But that is not the case for everybody in the league, and it's just one more factor. So, Sean, with that, I think the position battles are obvious. And to me, the most intriguing one continues to be tackle. We started talking about that a few minutes ago. I think clearly Jason Peters is going to be on the football team. Jermaine Ifedi is going to be your starting right tackle. Tevin Jenkins is probably, I would think, going to begin the season on the PUP list because they can then move him to the active roster and to injured reserve without risking waivers on him once they get past the final cut down. If they put him on injured reserve prior to the final cut, he is not eligible to return this season unless they work out an injury settlement and literally release him within 7 days of that designation. Then he can be re-signed after 3 weeks, but he's a free agent. He could be re-signed by anybody, so they really can't take that risk. One way or the other, Tevin Jenkins will be protected and inactive. Larry Borum is going to make this team. Alex Bars really has to make this team, not only because he is such excellent depth inside, having started at both guard and center, but many believe he is their best backup tackle as well. So right off the bat, with your 5 starters and those 2, you've got 7 guys. Normally, NFL teams carry 8 offensive linemen. I don't know that the Bears won't carry 9 because of the situation they're in, but I would have to think that after Alex Bars, the next closest to a sure thing is Larry Borum. He's not going anywhere. They like him. They think maybe he can compete at left tackle. He's going to make the football team. And now we get to Elijah Wilkinson, who I think is probably the 8th guy, but he's not a starting tackle in the NFL. I've seen enough to know that. And I'm not sure that he's a lock because they do have time and effort invested in Lachavious Simmons and Arlington Hambright. There's a few other guys that I know they've got an eye on. So I think we can name the first 7 Bears offensive linemen pretty safely, but whether they keep 8 or 9 and who those 8th or 9th are, I think is still fluid going into what we believe, at least until we hear differently, is going to be this last exhibition.
Those are really good points about Simmons and Hambright, Hub. You know, they have invested so much time over the last couple of years into those guys. I do think that they like Wilkinson's versatility to play on both sides, right and left tackle, and there's something to say about experience in NFL games, even if it's not a ton of experience on the left side. That might be an argument in his favor. And you're right about Alex Bars. I mean, he's so versatile. They can play him inside. They can play him outside. He's going to be on this roster. And I think Larry Borum is going to be on the roster as well. They've had him lining up at left tackle behind Jason Peters. He's slid in there a few times and gotten some good reps. And I think they want to see where that goes, especially with Tevin Jenkins out right now. And yeah, I'm with you. They're gonna protect Jenkins in some way, because they just have too much riding on that pick being successful here, you know, not just this year, but in the future.
So, Kyle, here's what's interesting to me about Sean's comments about Wilkinson, and I don't disagree with anything he said, but we are asked to believe that Wilkinson has that versatility by the Chicago Bears. Yeah. I don't know anybody who thought he could play left tackle when they signed him. He was an undrafted free agent who made the Broncos team and stayed there 4 years. In 4 years, he had 26 starts, and I want to say 19 at tackle and 7 at guard. I could be wrong about that, but none at left tackle. And most of the NFL people I talk to question whether he can play tackle at all, let alone left tackle, maybe a backup guard. And I haven't seen anything on the practice field or in these exhibition games to suggest to me that evaluation is necessarily off by much.
I agree with you. I think that, you know, if you have a pretty large sample size of him not being able to play at this level with the Denver Broncos, a team that is, you know, not exactly stacked on the offensive line. So, you know, him not being able to keep a starting position there. He has not done anything on the practice field or during preseason to really make you feel any better about it. You know, if I'm the Bears, you did invest draft picks into Arlington Hambright and Latavius Simmons last year, not high picks by any means, 7th rounders, right? I think they were both 7th rounders.
Yes.
Yeah. But I don't think either of those guys have done something where, you know, enough to get themselves cut. While I've watched Elijah Wilkinson or I've watched him so far and went, yeah, that's not a thing that's going to work.
Yeah, I don't. Latavius Simmons has probably gotten more snaps than any other offensive lineman on the team during this preseason.
He has, yeah.
And, yeah, they've all been at right tackle, and he's somebody that they're obviously at least trying to develop there. I talked to one former Chicago Bear offensive lineman, and a pretty good one actually, for a period of time, who was out at practice for the 2 days that the Dolphins were in town. And he kind of laughed and told me that the very first one-on-one drill that Wilkinson had against the Dolphins, and I don't even remember who the defender he was up against was, he called it the most embarrassing thing he'd ever seen. You know, and you know, he's a great kid. He's a great young man, and he's out there working, and I'm not trying to make fun or make light of him. I do think he's an NFL backup. But when you look at the Bears situation and you look at their need, even if Jason Peters is the answer, to develop depth at that position behind him, because you can't count on him being the answer at 40 and 41. And if you don't believe Wilkinson is, Sean, then I don't know why you use that roster spot on him as opposed to a youngster. And again, I'm not saying Simmons or Hambright are better, but they're younger and lesser are known, and they may have more room for growth.
Yeah, and maybe it was just a case of you know, being hopeful that maybe this guy can play left tackle and give him a look. And you know what, if it's not working, cut your losses and move on to the next thing. I could totally see that being the situation as well.
So guys, I think probably the next most difficult position to cut or keep for the Bears after the tackles is at wide receiver. And we did get some news today that certainly should not have been surprising. Javon Wims was released. When I say today, again, we are recording on Thursday. Another fine young man who's been here 3 years and really deserves a lot of credit because as a 7th-round pick out of Georgia, he had long odds to even make the football team. He wasn't just a practice squad guy. He was on the roster 3 years. He made an occasional play here and there. He made some contributions on special teams, but he also was inconsistent and made some or failed to make some plays that could have been game changers. And then with his brain fart, for lack of a better term, last year against the Saints in the regular season, I didn't understand just from the look of what happened there why he was still on the roster by the end of that game. I felt he was a real long shot to make the team this year. He has moved on, but we do know now at wide receiver that you have locks in Allen Robinson, Darnell Mooney, and Marquise Goodwin. I don't know that Damiere Byrd is a lock, but I think he's pretty close to it. I think that's why him and Goodwin were both brought in. So that's your first 4. Teams carry 5, 6, or 7. The Bears have traditionally carried 6. I think once you get past those 4, you get to a group of Rodney Adams, Riley Ridley, Daz Newsome, and then there are other names, but I think it's those 3 competing for either 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 spots, depending on what. I mean, maybe all 3 make it. Ridley, to me, is the most intriguing, Kyle, because the kid's been trying to get on the field for 2 years. When he's gotten on the field in those rare occasions, he's made some plays. He's looked like an NFL receiver. He's not a 1 or a 2, but he may be a 3 or a 4, and yet they obviously don't trust him for whatever reason. He's had a good camp, not a great camp. He has still made the occasional drop or been in the occasional wrong place, but he's also made some really nice plays. And when you look at his career coming out of Georgia as a 4th-round pick that most people thought was a 2nd or 3rd rounder, with this group, I would think that he should make this team, but based on the way the Bears have reacted to him the last 2 years, I'm not so sure he isn't a long shot because, now Rodney Adams and Daz Newsome are the flavors of the month.
It wouldn't surprise me to see Riley Ridley, based on how the Bears have used him or not used him, I guess I should say. This could be the end for Riley Ridley in a Bears uniform. Hub, you've been doing this a lot longer than I have. You see a guy like Rodney Adams doing what he's doing in the preseason. It's been awesome. He's a great story. How much does that matter, though?
I think it matters a lot. We talked to Matt Nagy specifically about that this morning, Thursday morning, and he went to pains to point out not only has Adams made what he called 2 great catches, one, of course, the first big play in Justin Fields' NFL career, and the second, the only big play that Andy Dalton has made so far as a Chicago Bear. But he pointed out, he said he's made 2 great catches, and he then added 2 special catches. And the fact that he felt the need to add that after saying they were great catches, to me, that spoke volumes. He then talked about the great character and the way this kid's carried himself and having retired from the game and trying to come back. And then for our listeners who don't know, just last Friday, he and his wife had their first child, a baby girl. He was at the hospital all night, got maybe 4 or 5 hours sleep on the couch with his little girl next to him and his wife in bed, and then went out to Soldier Field and made that play that he did for Andy Dalton and the Bears. And I'm sure a lot of fans didn't even know what that end zone celebration was, but that was him rocking the baby who was just born the night before. It's pretty obvious to me that the Bears are very impressed by Rodney Adams. And, when you look back at his career and the way it's gone, it's not a fluke. I mean, the kid he's got nice speed. He seems to have very good hands. He appears to be a disciplined route runner. So I can't, Kyle, really see any reason that Rodney Adams is not going to make the football team.
I feel like he has the inside track. One thing I will say is wide receiver is always, to me, the most difficult position to predict when it comes to how they're going to cut down. I just think back, all of it can do it. There are those training camp and preseason stars, and they all seem to come from the wide receiver position. Then 5 years later, you're standing on a training camp sideline, and you're talking about, hey, you remember that guy? You know what I mean? You get the feel that Rodney Adams is that guy, and sometimes they work out. But you also no, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I was gonna say it comes down to that kind of feel compared to a guy like Riley Ridley that they invested a draft pick in, Daz Newsome they invested a draft pick in this year that they like. It's when you start weighing those things, I often wonder how teams decide, how to figure out who they're going to keep on the bottom of the active roster at wide receiver.
Yeah, Kyle, I think you're right. I would just add there, though, that while they did invest a 4th-round pick in Ridley, they haven't seemed too happy about it. And it's been 2 years now, going into year 3, and I don't think the 6th-round pick that they spent on Daz Newsome is going to stop them or force them to keep a lesser talent. Now, they do seem to like Newsome a lot. They do think that he may give them something in the punt return game, and that has not been settled yet. We'll get to this in a minute, but I have no certainty at this point. As a matter of fact, I'm doubtful at this point that Tariq Cohen is going to be ready for the opener. I think that he's another one who probably starts the season on the PUP list, which gives them 3 more weeks, before they have to make a decision. Didn't expect that going into camp, but he hasn't worked a day since camp started, and he doesn't, Sean, he doesn't appear to be moving all that nimbly out on the field. He's out there every day, but he doesn't even look like himself in shorts and a jersey.
Yeah, I'll give him credit. He's out there every day. He's talking to his teammates and doing what he can from the sideline. But you're right. I mean, he doesn't seem to be fully bending his knee all the way. He's walking a little stiffly. He hasn't had a brace on, for whatever that's worth, at least not in recent days. But I would fully I mean, he hasn't practiced at all. I don't see how that he's going to be ready for the regular season. I would fully expect him to be on the PUP list or whatever it may be.
Well, and Kyle, another consideration here is if that's the case, they could very well choose from opening day to go with 3 running backs and 7 wide receivers. They could juggle the numbers there, especially if they think it's only for 3 weeks, because you can treat Tariq Cohen as either. And when Tariq Cohen is healthy in himself, then the Bears really only need 5 wide receivers, maximum 6, because he becomes a wide receiver who's going to line up occasionally outside or in the slot. So, a lot of these wide receiver decisions, I think, are going to be based on how ready Cohen is, as well as which of these 3 that we're talking about they like the most. What is interesting in Riley Ridley's favor is that he is the most different from Tariq Cohen and Marquise Goodwin and Damiere Byrd. He is your classic possession receiver and would probably be the only one on the roster who becomes kind of a backup to Allen Robinson if A-Rob should go down. So I don't know. If you'd asked me going into camp, I would have thought that Ridley was really in trouble. But now that he has at least outplayed Wims and we see this developing and we're not sure about Cohen, my guess is that they carry 6 rather than 7 because there are other log jams at various positions. But it could be Adams and Ridley, and they could try and get Newsome to the practice squad, or they're going to have to carry 7. I don't think they're going to cut Ridley because they're not going to get him to the practice squad. And so it's just kind of a gut hunch I'm going with, Kyle.
You're right. They're not going to get him to the practice squad. And I actually think that's a really good point by you about they don't have a lot of size. We talked about it all offseason. Not a lot of size in the wide receiver corps. When you combine that with the fact that they just went ahead and parted ways with Javon Wims, you were right. Ridley is really the only one you feel comfortable out there on the outside, which I would think would probably give him an inside track on a roster spot.
Yeah, I mean, this is a lot of fun. We're going to get the answers in about, 96 hours or whatever it may be between now and 3 o'clock Tuesday. But it is what complicates this quite a bit. I'm doing this in the order of, I think, concern and uncertainty as opposed to just going position by position. I think once they figure out the tackles and the wide receivers, they're going to turn their focus to these cornerbacks. And Sean, interesting there, Desmond Trufant was not a lock to be the starter across from Jaylon Johnson. I thought he had the inside track. It now looks like that's a 2-horse race between Kindle Vildor and Artie Burns. It looked like Kindle Vildor might have claimed that spot until this week, but Artie Burns has been getting a lot of time running with the ones now. But in the case of Desmond Trufant. He's been absent for some time now due to a personal issue. Matt Nagy talked about it. I think it was just yesterday, Wednesday, said the team fully supports him. It's a very real personal issue that he's dealing with, that they hope to get him back. But I don't know at this point that he's a lock to make the team, just because he's 31 years old and because they like Vildor and they like Burns and they say they like Thomas Graham Jr., who I'm not sure if he's a safety or a corner. And you still got Tease Tabor hanging around, who's competing at safety, but really was a corner coming out of school. So when we start to look for these surprising vets who not make it, I don't think they'll cut Desmond Trufant, but I wouldn't rule it out. They're probably going to carry 6 corners. And now with Michael Joseph being released last week, I think it was. Now they did replace Javon Wims with another corner. Is it Isaiah Coulter? Is that I'm trying to remember. I don't have it in front of me. Deontay Ruffin, yes, that's right. He was here and was released a while back. I don't think he's going to rise from the ashes like a phoenix and suddenly claim a roster spot. He's probably back for a chance to be on the practice squad. But as you look at this cornerback room and you think they're going to end up with 6, I think the big benefactor from Trufant's missing time and maybe not being available on opening day is Duke Shelley, who I think was on the bubble. But I now look at the possible 3 boundaries leaders or starters as, of course, Jalen Johnson, Kendall Vildor, and Artie Burns. Then I think now Duke Shelley is probably in pretty good shape, as is Desmond Trufant. That is still just 5. What does that say about Tease Tabor? What does that say about a Trey Roberson, who, no matter what he does, can't seem to stay healthy and get on the field, as excited as they were about him? There's not as much of a logjam as we thought there was, Kyle, but there's Sean, but there's no certainty as how they stack on the depth chart now.
No, there's really a lot of guesswork at this position, and I'm with you. I could see them, parting with Desmond Trufant, but I don't expect it necessarily. I mean, he's a guy who has a ton of experience, and he was a little banged up earlier in camp, and you can't really fault him for missing time for a personal issue. I would expect him to be around. I don't necessarily know what to make of what we've seen from Artie Burns thus far, but he's certainly going to be around as well. And certainly, we'll see here once we get the regular season going, what exactly you have in him versus Kendall Vildor at that cornerback spot. And I mean, Trey Roberson, he's been out there a lot this training camp. We saw him a little bit last year before he got injured. I believe we saw him a little bit last year before he got injured. He's been out there, but it's hard to know exactly if they see him as a guy who's going to make the roster or not. I would expect Thomas Graham to be around because he is, they invested the draft pick in him. I don't think they're going to want to cut their losses there yet. And he's a guy who seems at least like he's capable of playing a couple of different positions. We don't know what his best spot is at this point, but the Bears certainly want to find out.
Yeah, Roberson actually did not play last year.
Did he not play at all?
Training camp injury last year too, and I don't think he even made it to the exhibition games before he ended up on injured reserve. I did leave out Xavier Crawford, who's a guy we haven't really seen anything of, but was on the practice squad last year and is somebody they have gone out of their way to protect. So, really you've got 8 corners in Kendall Vildor, Desmond Trufant, Duke Shelley, Xavier Crawford. And then you go over on the other side as I try and get the depth chart back up here because they don't make it easy for some reason. And on the other side, you find the same guys. On the other side, you find Jalen Johnson, Artie Burns, Thomas Graham Jr., and Trey Roberson. So you've got 8 from which you're going to keep 6. And then you plug in Ruffin, who they just brought back. So it's a numbers game, but maybe not as confusing as we think.
I took a look at Desmond Trufant's contract just out of curiosity too. So if they did part ways with him, it would save him a little over $1 million, which isn't a ton, but there are going to be some street free agents or guys that end up on the street as we see rosters cut down. And maybe if they decide they need depth at a certain area and they say, hey, that little bit of extra money might do us better elsewhere if we feel good with Kendall Vildor and Artie Burns.
Kyle, it could, but this is where I think we make a mistake sometimes. When you say it could save him a little over $1 million, Is that the non-dead money on the contract?
Yeah, that is the
All right,
non-dead
so
money.
yeah, but where that's a little misleading is that if they don't keep him, they're going to keep somebody else, and even if it's the rookie minimum, they're going to pay that guy $695.
Yeah, that's true.
So, but there's a $500,000 in savings, and by the way, they're cap strapped enough that $500,000 could matter. So
yeah,
it is a
that's
very
what.
good point.
Let's say Jason Peters goes out and struggles, and they say this might not work with him at left tackle. We need to bring another guy in. Yeah, that $500,000 might make a difference.
Well, and that's where we're going to wrap in just a minute. But I want to talk about one more position. Is that this is the first time I think ever that the league has put an extra week in between the last preseason game and the first regular season game. So normally what happens is they were making these final cuts at 3:00 on Saturday. Monday, teams were going in to install their game plan, and the following either Thursday, Sunday, or Monday they were playing. What's happening this year is they're making those cuts on Tuesday, but then next week becomes almost an extension of training camp after the cuts, where they're going to practice Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, then take off Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and then come back the following Monday for a full week of game prep. So there is going to be, in essence, a fourth wave of free agency with all the veterans and other youngsters that hit the streets on Tuesday. And I think every team is going to probably add a few players. The Bears will be no exception. Now, whether that's they try and add a couple veterans, maybe at tackle, wide receiver, or cornerback, or whether they just go for some youth to improve the level of talent in the practice squad, that remains to be seen. But there will be that as well. The one other position that I think they're going to have some trouble cutting down at is edge rusher. And it's not because there is any question about who the first three are. You know, we know that that's Robert Quinn and Khalil Mack and Jeremiah Adochu. But then normally you would carry 9 linebackers total, and that usually works out in a 3-4, 9 linebackers in a 3-4. It usually works out with 4 inside and 5 outside. In the case of the Bears, though, Christian Jones is going to make this football team. He can play inside or outside. He has done both for the Bears and the Lions, so that gives you some extra flexibility. But we have to assume that, again, depth chart-wise, the 4 inside guys are going to be obviously, you know, Roquan Smith, Danny Trevathan, it looks like Alec Ogletree and Christian Jones. You go outside now, and you are looking at making choices after you get past your starters between Trevis Gibson, James Vaughters. You've got this undrafted rookie free agent, Charles Snowden, on the roster right now. And then you also have Sam Kamara, number 72. So you've got 4 guys looking at 1 or 2 positions. There's no question in my mind that Trevis Gibson is going to make the team. And so do you stop there? Do you say goodbye to James Vaughters, who was a contributor last year, or Snowden, who was a priority free agent, who you may or may not be able to get to the practice squad? He's not going to be a factor this year. He's a kid that needs 10, 15 pounds in the weight room and a lot more time, but he is a unique frame and prospect at that position. So, Sean, to me, this is one more that is pretty tough for them to cut down. And then if you keep those 4 inside guys or 3 inside guys in the hybrid that I mentioned in Christian Jones, that means you're cutting Joel Ayabuniwe and Josh Woods, who can't play outside linebacker, but have been special teams contributors. And the special teams have been a mess so far in training camp, and don't look to get better quick without, you know, your all pro special teamer in Cordero Patterson, your former Pro Bowl special teamer in Sherrick McManus. So these linebackers are a bit of a muddle right now, if you will, as well.
Yeah, don't underestimate that need on special teams, because it hasn't looked good. And Joel Iggy has experience there. Josh Woods has experience there. It sounds like Alec Ogletree is gonna give it a go and do some special teams this year. He sounds a little bit excited about that in a you know, for a veteran. That's not always something that you see. You know, Charles Snowden is a guy that you would like to get on the practice squad. You know, like you said, Hub, he's tall. I think he's 6'7". He's a little bit lanky. You'd like to put a little more weight on that frame. But he's also a guy who I don't know that you're going to be able to get him to your practice squad. I mean, other teams might see that and want to invest in that as well. I'm with you. I think Trevis Gibson is definitely a lock. I think James Vaughters is a guy who they like a lot, and I think he's going to wind up here. So it's going to be a tough one to figure out between you know, the inside and the outside linebackers.
Yeah, and one of the things to keep in mind, guys, some of the idiosyncrasies of how these rules all work, you can't get anybody to the practice squad without cutting them first and exposing them to waivers. I don't think if they put Snowden on waivers that he will go unclaimed. The problem is the team that claims him then has to give him a spot on their 53-man roster. So now you're probably talking about one of these weaker teams that is still filling out depth charts anyway. But if they don't keep him on that 53-man roster, if he ends up on somebody else's practice squad, then you can always go out and try and re-sign him and bring him back. So I think that as intriguing as he is, when you look at these other roster battles, Kyle, he's a guy they're just going to have to take their chances with and expose him, and then we'll see what happens down the road.
Yeah, I agree with you. One thing I kind of feel that that outside linebacker is kind of the same as offensive tackle in terms of where you're looking where you can cut elsewhere to kind of create some depth at those positions. We don't know what the Bears are going to get out of Robert Quinn yet. We're expecting him, at least we're anticipating he bounces back somewhat. But let's say he struggles again, and you are hurting for pass rush. You're going to want these bodies to be able to rotate through because none of them are locks to really give you what you need. I like Travis Gibson. I think he's progressing in the arc that I want to see from him. But to me, that the edge rush is still a concern until we know that Robert Quinn is actually going to contribute.
It's an excellent and a fair point, Kyle. I will tell you, if I had to pick the veteran who's maybe had the best training camp so far, it might be Robert Quinn. I mean, he's looked really good out there. He's the fastest guy off the ball every day. After some concerns early on, Sean, I think he's only had 3 or 4, veteran day off or nagging type injury precautionary things. And he looks really good right now. He looks like the guy that we thought they were getting when they guaranteed him $30 million. But he's going to have to show that on the field to be able to stay and keep that job. So, guys, the last piece I said we would get to before we're going to have to say goodbye this week is this fourth wave of free agency, if you will. There are going to be some surprises out there. There's going to be some veterans who can play. Now, the Bears, unfortunately, I haven't looked lately where they're at against the cap, but I know it can't be good. I'm sure they can create enough cap space one way or the other to make a key addition if there's somebody out there worth getting. But Sean, Matt Nagy was pretty definitive Thursday morning when asked the question. He said, oh, yeah, we're going to be looking at everybody else who ends up on the waiver wire.
Yeah, he totally was. He said, Ryan Pace and his guys are right now evaluating some of these other teams and trying to predict who could wind up on the street and trying to get a head start on that process. Obviously, you're not going to know until Tuesday who's available and who's not, but I think teams are really gearing up for this, especially with the extra week. I mean, you have a little bit more time to figure out what you want to do with some of these guys on the street.
It will be interesting. And as you look around the league, Kyle, I can't really predict a ton of cap casualties. We know there will be some. I think this is more likely where teams are adjusting their cap because they have a young talent who may be ready more quickly than they expected. I've actually seen a few names out there that have surprised me. I know some folks are predicting that the Dallas Cowboys, if they can't trade Jalen Smith, could release him. That'd be an upgrade to anybody's linebacker core. There was even some comment that Landon Vander Esch could be in trouble. Now, he's an injury waiting to happen, so I don't know if you want him. And I don't think that's the Bears' greatest need. I think if the Bears do go out and do something, I'd be surprised if it was a player like Jalen Smith. But if there is a player out there with 40, 50, 60 career spots at the starts at the tackle position, who is obviously an upgrade over Elijah Wilkinson, that's the first thing I would keep an eye on. I also would keep an eye on a bigger possession type receiver if it's a very accomplished guy who they might be able to immediately say, hey, whatever the challenge is between Rodney Adams, Daz Newsome, and Riley Ridley, this guy's obviously better than all three of them. I think that's the kind of move they'll try and make to pump up their quarterback hopes, regardless of who the quarterback is.
Yeah, I agree. Offensive tackle definitely comes first, wide receiver probably second. It kind of sounds like we're back to the draft talk here when I start saying stuff like that. But I'm just kind of flipping through. I haven't seen any rumors about any offensive tackles yet. You talk about bigger kind of possession receiver. a guy that it sounds like may, despite just ending up there in Detroit, Rashad Perriman might not make that roster. I mean, I'm not a Rashad Perriman guy, but that kind of fits the mold of what you're looking for.
I must have misread. I thought he was cut yesterday or today. I'm not positive of that.
I may have missed it already. I mean,
I may have just been reading the report that he was on the bubble too, but I thought that maybe they'd already pulled the trigger on him. And this is a former first-round draft pick who's never really succeeded anywhere, but a lot of it has been injuries and just not ending up in the right situation. So, kind of interesting name to keep an eye on. Guys, we are out of time for this week's edition of our podcast. We do want to give our thanks to our great sponsors, the Heinz Lumber Company. They have 11 locations throughout Chicagoland, the place to go for all of your building needs, any rehab or redecorating needs that you might have. Even if you're building from scratch, you want to get over to one of our Heinz locations, they will take great care of you, and we appreciate them sponsoring our podcast. We want to remind you all that we're going to come to you every week now with the season underway. You can go to your app store. You can go to shawlocal.com. You can go to iTunes and download a subscription to our podcast so it comes to you automatically each week. If you enjoy joining us on StreamYard, where we are right now, you can participate in our podcasts. And other than the guy who reminded us about Dane Sanzenbacher, I didn't see a lot of guys checking in with questions today. For every Dane Sanzenbacher, I'm going to raise you a Daniel Braverman. There are all kinds of guys we can pick out there. Even Cam Meredith is an interesting one. I mean, here's a priority undrafted rookie free agent who looked like he was going to have a long career as a Bear, and then unfortunately the ACL really cut him short. He did end up down in New Orleans. I don't think he's still in the league. But at any rate, we want to thank all of you for being with us each week, and we hope that you will join us again next week right here on our shawlocal.com Bears Insider Podcast.